Can you share your screen though?
I can.
Okay.
I'm just waiting until,
We're live. Welcome, everybody, back to the House General and Housing Committee. And it is today, Friday, January 31, 2025. And our last witness of the day is Maura Collins, ED of the Vermont Housing and Financing Agency. I am sure that Maura knows everybody on this committee. And so as much as you'd like to introduce yourself to her, I think we'll skip that. And so Maura, take it away, introduce yourself and start your testimony.
thank you. I'm Maura Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and I'm going to walk us through a bit of a housing funding primer, as well as that relates to the cost of housing. And I'm happy to be interrupted with questions. But first, I wanted to tell you that it costs more to build housing than it used to. This is national data. This is not Vermont-based data, but this chart, the blue bars show you what the costs were for different building materials between 2016 and 2020. And then the red bars show you what's happened since 2020 through 2024. And you can see that across the board, except for softwood lumber, the costs have increased dramatically. Again, national data.
Question. Have you seen or heard of any moderation in the price increases of
Yes.
some materials?
Yep.
In other words, we went through that huge supply chain problem.
What I have not seen is a drop. So I would stand by, the red bars and say that the increases are slowing down. I cannot think of an example where I've heard that prices have come down. Now with the further implementation of a Buy America, Build America Act that passed a few years ago that is, has an implementation process of applying to affordable housing. That has the potential of driving up costs or slowing things down. The talk of tariffs is a
Tariffs.
concern.
Yeah. What do we get? Could you be a little more specific about the tariffs? What do
With
we
the
get
president?
from Canada?
The lumber is a big one.
Lumber back.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Sorry.
Yep. I mean, I'm not prepared to speak to it now. I have been hearing also, while I work in housing, I also talk to a lot of utility companies because utilities are critical to housing. And I want to call out that I do believe that their electricity, natural gas, there are things we should be thinking about even beyond the cost of housing that will impact the cost of owning and operating housing, as well as the materials like we're talking about.
Go ahead.
Sure.
No, it was just about the slides.
So I have a concern and I don't know if you have any way of providing any information. The wildfires in California. I'm assuming it's an assumption, but looking at the stats right there, I'm assuming lumber costs are about to go through the roof again. Is there any way for us to?
Can we get lumber from
I don't think what's burning, it's logging. No, it's the rebuilding.
Oh, that part, sorry.
That
My
makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Is there any way for us to be prepared and do we know what that might look like for us? Am I just being super freaked out?
You're not being super freaked out. And one reason I would like to think I keep getting invited back is because I only speak to things that I have real numbers on. And
I love your real numbers.
I would not be able to quantify what that impact is, but I think that the fear is real. And I think that it's coming from all angles. And I would also add to that, just natural disasters in general are driving up the cost of construction, as is it's driving up the cost of insurance. And if you'd like to have another whole hearing on that, I have a lot to say about the cost for homeowners and rental housing developments and the 20% plus increase in cost of insurance.
Did you have a question? Did you have a question about the slide?
No,
Okay.
I got it.
So costs are going up everywhere. These are Vermont numbers. This chart here shows that the applications that VHFA received for one of our programs, which I'll be talking about later, called the 9% tax credit program. You can see how the average cost per apartment went from $286,000 a few years ago to now well over $500,000 per apartment. I want to be clear that these numbers often track in line with what we see a single family new construction home is, and this is similar to that. But the impact is in the bullets at the bottom, which is theoretically, if the state had $10 million to spend in 2018 to build this type of tax credit housing, we could have built 35 apartments. That same $10 million last year would have only gotten us 19 apartments. And so just the impact to cost is decreasing the amount of housing that we can build, affordable housing, because it takes more money to build the same number of apartments. Yep,
Sorry, real quick.
don't apologize.
And somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I think we heard testimony from a small developer about the cost, about his cost to build affordable units. And that cost was significantly lower.
Yep.
And so how, is this strictly because of the for-profit, nonprofit, like why are these numbers not giving the same yield that it would?
I'm definitely going to answer that.
Okay,
Not for a couple slides.
okay, thank you,
But I heard of that testimony and I'm ready to speak to it.
thank you.
So, because that testimony is not just that developer. There are lots of developers out there, small for-profit market rate developers who will tell you that they look at the numbers on the last slide and they say, I can definitely do cheaper than that. And they're right. What also needs to be known is that they are not building the same thing as what this affordable housing is building. And that's what I want to show you in a couple slides.
Okay.
But because this has been a long-standing discussion, we in the affordable housing world wanted to really look at this. And so in 2019, we did a study that looked at what are the cost drivers of affordable rental housing creation. And then we really wanted to look at market rate data and find out if they had the same cost drivers or different ones. We wanted to get exactly at that point, which is does it cost the same or different to be a nonprofit doing affordable housing versus a private for-profit doing market rate housing? The affordable housing, we got all the numbers on, all those budgets and actual number, not just what they thought, but then what actually happened. They have to certify and send to us. I got tons of data on that and I can talk to you all day long about what gets our money because they have to show it to us. Market rate developers do not have to show us that level of detail and so far have not broadly brought forward that. There are case studies that people will bring, like I built a development in this town and here was my experience, but I can't compare the universe of all the affordable housing to a case study in this town that was 6 units or whatever it was, because it's not apples to apples. So we didn't have that perfect answer, but we did have enough of an answer where we're looking at what's happening in Vermont compared to neighboring states, what's happening in Vermont compared to national trends, what's happening in Vermont compared to what and databases say should be happening in Vermont, what's happening in Vermont today compared to Vermont of the past. And we looked at these things to look at these cost drivers. And these 8 bullets were the highlights of that 2019 report. The 2019 report, just so you know, you have a link to it in my previous testimony from a week or 2 ago. It was one of the resources I told you to point you to. And you can read this yourself, but you can see that it's labor and materials. It's that our developments do not have an economy of scale. When I talk to my national peers, they're putting up 100, 200, 300 unit apartments. There's an economy of scale there that we don't have. When you're putting 1 or 2 elevators into a building that has 24 apartments, it's the same cost as if you're spreading those elevator costs across 60 apartments. And you still may need just the same 1 or 2 elevators. There are locally required fees that add costs. There are Act 250 processes. This was a 2019 study. So again, we've made a lot of progress in addressing some of these things. There are often uncoordinated levels of approvals. Again, that has been somewhat addressed. Infrastructure adds costs. We've talked about that before, about how developers now are bearing that cost where it used to be municipalities. There are substantial project reserves that come into play with affordable housing. And the last point about the policy priorities is what I'm going to talk about more. There were recommendations in 2019 telling the affordable housing funders what we should do to lower the cost. And they got broken into these 4 quadrants of big impact and super easy to do. Please do that top left quadrant versus less impact, easier implementation. You can see the green stars are ones where we've made substantial progress. The ones without green stars, we have yet to make substantial progress. This report is about 5 years old, and so I do not like the fact that there's not more green stars on this. I do have to remind you all there's a pandemic in the meantime, and we did shift from, looking at some of these things toward the massive outpouring of resources and getting projects up to speed and all that. That does not mean that we have turned a blind eye to cost. I want to be very clear. And the focus on housing has been tremendous, and there's been a lot going on. There's more to be done, though, is my point.
Can I ask a really quick question? Recommendations, is this just for VHFA or do other agencies also share these recommendations?
This was a joint report between VHFA, VHCB, the Housing Conservation Board, the Department of Housing and Community Development that we did together. And so these recommendations were for all of us. One that says, look at tax credits, that's gonna be on us because we're the administrator. But we do work hand in hand on all these things. But, we've talked about studying the, looking at alternative fee structures and studying the life cycle costs of housing and all that. Some of these research projects just have not moved forward yet.
Okay, thank you.
So historically, we did a lot of tax credit housing that was paired with state resources. And I'm going to talk more about how that works in a second. But in the last few years, you all have expanded the tools in the toolbox to go beyond just that deeply subsidized housing. And also we now have homeownership creation programs. We have the rental revolving loan fund I've spoken about, as well as the VHIP program. The point of this slide is to show that each of these are very different. They serve different public policy goals. You can see at the income levels that people reached are very different. On the left, you see that the average tenant income for tax credit housing or deeply subsidized housing is $17,000 a year annual income for the household. That is a very different population than when we're serving people at 150% of median income, which could be $90,000 a year. So when you are having deeply subsidized units with a ton of public policy goals that you're trying to accomplish, which I'm about to talk about, that is very different than a higher income household. And you're just building some affordable units, but there's not a lot of other public policy goals being reached with those programs. But it's been a good thing that there are more tools in the toolbox for us to point to. I think I've shown you this slide before. I'm going to show it to you every time I come here. We say we do housing, we're doing far more than that. And this is where I want to get to, which gets to these public policy goals. We are doing so much more around energy and cleaning up our soils and transportation and infrastructure and services and things like that. This slide may not be necessary for this committee, but when we talk about, and this is where I'm going to start bringing in the cost of housing. When we talk about what's the cost of housing, look at that signpost graphic on the left. It's not just development, which people focus on, the second one down. It is pre-development, which covers the risk. It's the, I'm going to buy this piece of land and I'm going to hope that I can get the permits. I'm going to hope that the interest rates are about what they are now or better. I'm going to hope that I can get this thing built and through the neighbors and all that. There is a cost to that because there are lots of developers out there who own pieces of land that they are sitting on that are not going to become housing right now because it didn't get through the pre-development costs. And so they are having the carrying costs of that and just the upfront costs of it. There's also, I'm going to skip over development and say there's the operating costs of the housing, as well as the services that go with this housing. There are a lot of costs to housing beyond development. But if we talk about development costs, because we want to compare apples to apples, okay? We are talking about the acquisition of the land or any existing buildings. We're talking about the hard costs, the labor and materials that goes into the contractor building the property. There's the soft costs, which are the architects, the engineers, the lawyers, the insurance, and like I said, the carrying costs of that, as well as reserves. Here's a difference between what you're going to hear from a market rate developer and a affordable housing developer. Reserves. I want to just point to this as one example. A market rate developer will have to have some money in the bank, some reserves, to cover the risk that they're going to go out of business during construction, and or the lease up period will be longer than we expect. And those reserves are going to be set by the lender. Someone is giving that person a construction loan, and that lender is going to say, I want you to have this much money sitting in a bank account so that if you go out of business and I end up owning a partially completed piece of land and a half-done building, I not only have that asset, but I also have some money to hire someone to go and finish what you started to do. And costs have probably gone up and I gotta go get it all rebid, and there's, carrying costs. So the lender is going to determine how much have to be in reserves. When you do affordable housing, if we have a loan on it, we're going to do the same thing, require those reserves and a little more. We're going to make sure that you have reserves set aside so that you don't need to come back to us and ask for money regularly, where there's going to be operating reserves and different types of reserves. That can bring up the cost of the housing. Therefore, one of the recommendations in our study was, can y'all look at those reserves a little closer? Can you just reality check that they're appropriate? And I do not have a straightforward answer for you about if they're appropriate. There are some developments in Vermont that I'm going to say probably are a little over-reserved. There's a lot of properties in Vermont that are under-reserved. And so overall, we're looking at Massachusetts has some way of sharing reserves across multiple projects. That hurts my brain to think about because these are all distinctly owned properties, but there are probably some creative ways that if we had a little more time and energy, we could look at reserves differently. And that's an example of a research project that needs to be done and is not yet completed.
Question.
So when VHFA is the financial agent for a development, you're saying that you don't have a massive chunk of reserves that you there's not a central reserve for VHFA?
Not a central one, each
Development by
project.
development.
Mhm.
And it's got to be higher because of, that's something that we have legislated than
No,
what
not
regular
really
developers?
legislated. Sometimes these are gonna be tax credit developments and the investor is gonna require reserves. So like I as a lender will require reserves, and then the investor wants to see maybe higher reserves and in order to buy those tax credits, and none of us legislate them. This is the market we live in, and this is the program the feds gave us, and so they require high reserves as an example.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are many sources of funding for affordable housing. And here are some examples at a high level. When the cost of housing goes up, we have to add more layers to this cake, but the cake is not getting bigger. When the cost of housing goes up, we don't go from having a 12-inch cake to a sheet cake. It's more, we go from having a 12-inch cake to a taller 12-inch cake. We need to layer on more resources to cover the increasing cost of housing. And so there is a report linked at the bottom here, which is a report you all require us all as funders to create every year. It's called the Housing Budget and Investment Report. And every year for the last 10 years, they're all online. You can see how much, like meaning I got these amounts in the parentheses from that report, how much Vermont is getting or spending from federal resources and various state resources. It even brings in some AHS money in terms of saying how much is being spent on supported housing and all that. And so you can see the first one's in italics because it was a weird year. 24 was the last year we happened to have the senior US Senator as the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee in Congress. And so we got a lot of congressionally directed spending for housing. That's unusual. There's always some money. It's not usually $14 million as a one-time thing. But more regularly, we can expect that there's about $6 million from the Community Development Block Grant Program, $3 million from the Home Program and other programs. Different agencies administer these different programs. It's largely VHCB, and DHCD runs the block grant program. And then other programs here, like these Section 811, Section 202, USDA, these are federal resources that come right from HUD or Department of Agriculture. The big behemoth is the orange one toward the bottom, where you can see that there are these low-income housing tax credits. That's a program that VHFA administers that I'm going to focus on because it, as you can see, at $41 million just last year, it far outweighs the other programs. This is not unusual. I'm going to call it the LIHTC program or the tax credit program because the initials spell out LIHTC. The LIHTC program is the largest source of affordable rental housing creation in the country. It's the 5th largest tax credit in the nation. So I know we talk about the child tax credit and different things like that, and the earned income tax credit, whatever. This is the 5th biggest one in the nation. So it's huge. Bipartisan support, been around since 1987. It is the gorilla in the room. I want to talk a little, well, I think I was asked to speak to a little more about the tax credit program, how it sets its priorities, how it kind of works, and I'll be weaving in some cost implications as I go. The first thing you should know is that this LIHTC program, this $41 million, is actually split between 2 different programs, and they're both called LIHTC. I'm sorry, I didn't make that decision, but the feds say there's 2 ways to get tax credits. There's a 4% tax credit and a 9% tax credit. My next slide is going to show you the difference. But before we get there, I just want to say 4% tax credits are going to be half as valuable as a 9% tax credit. Because 4 is less than half
Is
of
that
9.
9%? What's that? 9% of what? Per year total? Or
May I-
Fewer that I should just forget about it.
May I please not answer that question and instead lead you through the discussion? Because I think you'll be mad if I answered it. It's math. And at the end of the day, it's like, this is what's eligible and this is the math that happens. And then at some point, we multiply it by 4% and 9%. And that's how we find out how much money can be given to the housing development.
Okay,
Now, I want to talk about the 4% credit for a minute. You've seen this chart in my other testimony about how VHFA works, and I told you we borrow money, we lend it out, we get payments, and then we make payments, right? This is what we do. What I didn't tell you is that what that process is called when we're borrowing money is called that we are selling tax-exempt private activity bonds. I told you they were tax-exempt, they don't have to pay taxes on the earnings. I didn't tell you they were called private activity bonds, now I am. If you've ever listened to an e-board meeting, you have heard, it just happened a few weeks ago, that the state, the governor and the chair of the 4 money committees, the legislature, get to allocate the state's private activity bonds to a couple different entities. VHFA is one of them. VITA can sell these private activity bonds to do economic development. VSAC can sell these bonds to support higher ed. And the bond bank can sell these bonds to support infrastructure. So we thumb wrestle in a back room somewhere and decide how much do we all need of these bonds? And then the e-board says, okay, this is how much everyone needs. And when VHFA gets an allocation, and when we borrow to do multifamily housing, we are using these tax-exempt private activity bonds. Why am I telling you this when we're talking about tax credits? Because a developer who wants to use the 4% tax credits knows, how do I get those 4% tax credits? All I have to do is take my housing development that costs $10 million to build, and I have to make sure that at least 50% of that is funded with these tax-exempt private activity bonds. So I'm a developer. I don't have to do much. I know that I have a $10 million development. I'm gonna ask VHFA for a $5.5 million construction loan. Because I'm spending more than half of the cost of building this housing using these tax exempt private activity bonds, I'm gonna automatically get these tax credits. And I'm gonna tell you what they get for it. As I said, there are two types of tax credits, 4% bonds, 9%. I'm sorry, 4% credits, 9% credits. Either way, through the LIHTC program, the tax credit program, you're building the same kind of housing. No one would know the difference. It's rental housing. It's rental housing affordable to people earning 60% of median. And it's available to all developers, nonprofits, for-profits. They're doing the same thing. Just sometimes they're getting twice as much money for it as the other times. And I'm going to explain to you again how this works. The 4%, all I have to do as a developer is I have to finance at least half of my project with these private activity bonds, and I'm going to get an award of these credits. I do have to go to VHFA's board and I have to be underwritten and do some stuff. But my point is that they're automatic if you pass that test. These 9% credits
But only to the extent that you've been allocated enough money for the, in other words, at a certain point, you've used your allocation of private,
Activity bond.
private activity bonds.
theoretically, yes, and that has never happened in VHFA's history. So that's why it says how much is available. I say almost unlimited, because not only do we have this year's allocation, we can roll forward allocations from years past, and we have hundreds of millions of dollars available to us for these private activity bonds that we have not used. And we can only roll it forward for a certain number of years, but I'm saying Vermont is not at risk of hitting the cap of using these private activity bonds. Other states
4%
have,
limit.
exactly. So that's different than the 9%. The 9% are competitive. And we get a per capita allocation, and it roughly is between $30 and $40 million a year. And that is a competitive thing where every spring people apply to us, and in one board meeting, we award all of them because the demand for those 9% credits is easily twice, if not 3 times as much as what we have available. And so to a developer, I keep saying 9% is twice as valuable as 4%. The benefit row shows this. If I have my development costs, and if I'm thinking of a pie chart of what do I need for the $10 million to build this housing, the 4% tax credits are only going to give me about 35% of what I need. I need to fill the other 65% of the pie to get to my $10 million. I need to go look at that ugly colored layered cake and try to fill it in with HUD money, state money, beg, borrow, steal, no, debt, other things to fill in that part of the pie. Now, if I get the golden ticket and I get awarded from VHFA a 9% tax credit award, I got 70%, 7 million of the 10 million is coming from those valuable tax credits. Now I only need to find $3 million of other money. Maybe I can, but we only do 3, 4, 5, 9% tax credits a year. That's all we can award. And we could do more with 4%.
Do developers have a much easier time being granted the rest of the layers of cake when it's known that they have that 9%? I mean, you're just already on a better path to actually getting this thing built if you know you're getting 70% already covered.
There's no document that says that. And in my experience, yes, you are right. That if I know that, I sit on VHCB's board as well as the Community Development Block Grant Program. And I know that when it's the last $500,000, it is easier because there's all that leverage baked in and all that. So yes, but is that a criteria that they are technically judged by? Not that I can think of.
I do want to add one thing that occurs to me that you all should know. Very often when people are looking at development, they think, oh, well, the developer can pay that. The developer never pays anything. The development
Right.
pays it. And each development is a separate entity from every other development. And that's not just literally a separate entity. And the reason for that is not, and that's true of private developers. The reason for that is not just because they want to protect themselves. It's because most people who are dumping capital into a project, whether they're a bank or whether they're an equity investor, somebody's along for the ride, they want to evaluate that development for its success or
Not carry the
failure,
risk of
and not
every
carry the risk of
single.
anybody else or get into what is in legal terms, God forbid, called cross default, where something
Multiple
goes
things.
bad over here and it bleeds over here. They can't evaluate all of that. So every development is separate. And the development, it's not like the developer's gonna just, oh gee, throw in our own money. They'll get equity sources from different people, but it's the development itself that has to pay and make sense and pencil in the end. The capital stack is for that development. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's an excellent point. So because we know that the 4% tax credits are valuable, not as valuable, but they're valuable. That's 35%, just 35%. Let me step back if I could. Both these tax credit programs are governed by a document called the Qualified Allocation Plan, the QAP. That is a policy document that VHFA drafts. It gets approved by a committee called the Joint Committee on Tax Credits. It then goes to VHFA's board, and then it gets signed by the governor. The QAP is our public document that tells everyone what hoops you have to jump through to get these resources, to get the tax credits. We have to look at the IRS rules. These are tax credits, so this is run through the US Treasury, the IRS, so it's not HUD. So we have to look at the IRS rules, and we have to put in that QAP all the minutia of what the IRS requires. Then we get to make this work for Vermont. So what do we want to do above and beyond the IRS rules? Since the 4% tax credits are pretty much unlimited, and we're not feeling constrained by the cap or anything like that, we wanted to strip away as many extra things as possible. Just if we can make housing happen, let's make it happen. This isn't as valuable. You're not getting as much, but you are getting something. You're getting, in my $10 million project, you're getting $3.5 million of tax credits. So we have it where it says priorities to receive. We stick with just the IRS rules because we have to. And the only other things we add on and layer on to raise the bar is that we do care about the site. This has to be within historic settlement patterns, which is defined, but it's not quite as defined as like in a designated downtown, blah, blah. So it has to be smart growth. It should be mixed income because that is the best kind of outcome is mixed income properties. We have some higher income folks and some lower income folks. I got to tell you, that one gets waived a lot because it's complicated, but you don't get as much money if you have a lot of market rate housing. People erroneously think that market rate housing pays for the low income units. It's the opposite. The more tax credit units are going to pay for the higher income housing. So sometimes we waive this because we say, we're not going to have some higher priced apartments. We're not going to have the affordable apartments subsidizing the higher rent, higher income apartments. So sometimes that one gets waived, but we do. Mixed income is the way to go and is the best practice.
That just blew my mind a little.
I know.
Something that we really need to put some sort of pin on to really sink in.
I would say it happens more than just in housing too.
Yep. And so I'm going to talk a bit about commercial space as well, but if you think about it, with the math I didn't want to explain to you about how do you calculate how much you get of tax credits, it's prorated by how many affordable apartments do you have, right? Think about a federal program. You would only say, if half the units are affordable, then I'm only going to give you half of what you qualify for, versus if 100% of this building's affordable, then you can get the max of the math. So if you do an 80% affordable, 20% market rate building, you're only getting 80% of the maximum tax credits that the math would have given you, right? And what I'm saying is that the market rate rents on those 20% of the units do not make up for, you're not charging another $1,000 a month, you're charging something. They don't make up for the loss of tax credits because we had to prorate the tax credits. And so what would happen if we allowed this is we would have these affordable units subsidizing these market rate units. Sometimes there's value to that public policy goal because we have a mix of income in a building and that's the right thing to do. So anytime we can make it happen, we make it happen. There are some times where the math just doesn't work and we would have to have such luxury priced apartments. We'd have to have I'm making this up, but $4,000 a month apartments that are being subsidized by tax credit residents earning 17 grand a year. Like it just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And so we do waive that at times.
And so even knowing that you're not locked into a affordable housing rate unit in perpetuity, it's still not attractive. It'll even 30 years later, charging a little bit more, charging market rate, you'll never make up. Like, is there a breaking point where like, oh, actually, if you get this proportion, it works out within 8 years?
We look at all that when we're considering waiving and we can see that for the next 20 years, it's not.
Got it. Okay.
doesn't
So
make
this is everything that you just said about the affordable units subsidizing the market rate units. This is either 4% or 9%, either way.
Correct.
Okay,
This is in housing and to Representative Person's point, I think this happens even beyond housing where when there's government money involved, sometimes the government money is the better deal. And so it precludes some of these public policy goals. My point here was that we follow the IRS rules. We look at site, we look at mixed income. There's an executive order by the governor. It says that anything that gets any kind of public subsidy needs to have 15% of the units be occupied by people who are previously homeless. We do have universal design rules, I hope Representative Barrows especially knows, and building standards. But really, my point here is that we don't ask for a lot. The bar is not that high on these 4% credits. The 9% credits, meanwhile, has to do all of that. That's what that blue arrow means. We're doing all this stuff. And these get, for lack of a better term, scored because it's competitive and there's not enough money to go around. I said there's twice as much demand as there is resources. So we say we'll look more favorably on you if you're really in a downtown. If you serve more homeless folks, like at least 25% of the units are set aside for homeless. If you offer services to people who need it, if you hit deeper affordability, so not just 60% of median, but 30% of median. If you can take on more debt, so you're using fewer public resources, we like that. We like it when there's access to transportation. We like buildings that are at risk of loss, like you're gonna lose a public subsidy or this building is gonna come offline. Well, I don't say we like that. We like fixing that problem so we don't lose units. Brownfield remediation, cleaning up dirty dirt, historic buildings, energy efficient buildings. If we didn't have all these priorities, I think we would have, 6 times as much demand as we had resources available. So what's happening here is that we've been adding and adding and adding public policy good goals that serve Vermont because the resources are not enough to keep up with what we actually need. And so since it's so competitive, we just got to keep raising that bar. We've raised it to such a point that we still have twice as much demand as we have this. And it's with all these public policy goals. And this affordability is important too, that bond credits only require that the housing be affordable for 30 years. Now, if they got VHCD money or other things, it may also have to be perpetual. But my point is we only require 30-year affordability. The 9%, we even went so far, and this is unusual in the nation, but to have perpetual affordability, which you've heard some about. So I'm saying like that bar is high. Now the professor in me that I do on the side wants to turn back to you all and say, if you set the bar that high with all those public policy goals, what do you think also is happening to this housing development? It's expensive. It's expensive to do all that stuff.
So all of those public policies.
Yes.
Historic preservation, energy efficiency, et cetera. In order, one of the things that, and I want to just reiterate if this is the case, remember, if I'm a developer, I've got to raise the capital to build the development. And if I'm just a private developer, my choices are pretty simple. Either I get a loan from a bank, part of it, but they're not going to lend me more than maybe 50%. And then the rest, either either mom, which is like me, right? Or buddies, friends, equity investors that I get together and convince that this project is worth it. And that's it. That's it. There's no free money. However, tax credits are free money to the development in the sense that the money comes from outside. It's the federal government just pumping money into the development, right? It's like someone just said, here's a check. You don't have to pay me back. Nothing. It's free. I mean, it's true, it's not free to the federal government, but it's free essentially to the project. In return for all that free money, we are layering on all these other policies that have to do it. And so when we calculate the cost, tell me if I'm right, when we calculate the cost per unit, we don't subtract the free money. We just take the total cost of everything and divide it by the number of units. So it comes out high. If we were to subtract the cost somehow of the free money, well, it wouldn't be as high. But we don't.
And
Are
There
you
are-
with me? Am I right?
Yeah, and so this is free money that does not have to be paid back,
Right.
and it is there, and that is, it's done.
And so the high cost per unit of $500,000 a unit, where you were saying hard costs are like 460 some thousand or something like that. That assumes that the projects that they're talking about do all these things.
And this money doesn't have to be claimed and count, this does not count as income and does not get.
no, because this is not, no, this is a tax credit. When VHB awards a tax credit.
Yeah.
There's an entity that will go, that development doesn't have that kind of tax liability of millions of dollars. So they go and sell it and banks and other people
Yeah.
buy it and just give them cash.
Yeah.
And then they use that to pay for the construction. And so it's not, no, and then that investor gets to claim a tax credit.
Okay, thank you.
And so so for example, if I'm a private developer and I'm just gonna build 5,000 units. If I built those units in an historic district, and if I built them to be energy efficient, and if I and I built them in an urban center that was polluted and needed brownfields, et cetera, it wouldn't be quite as expensive as their unit because I wouldn't have to, if it's not a tax credit deal, I wouldn't have to pay Downs, Racklin and Martin. I wouldn't have to, they happen to be very good. I wouldn't have to pay DRM and I wouldn't have to pay an accountant and a few other things. But if I was still doing everything else, it would be kind of comparable to what they pay. Am I right?
That is what we tried to prove in our 2019 study. And I don't have the data to say if you're right or not, but yes, there are different ways of structuring this. I have a different way of answering the question, but I also happen to see that represent. So here's the question.
So that was the question I had, is that's what the difference is as far as the metrics from a private developer and going through these tax credits. Of course, theirs is going to be less to develop, because they're not doing all of those things that are included.
Tax credit housing compared to non-tax credit housing, yes, tax credit housing is going to be more expensive because we've raised the bar here. And I know you have a question. I also have a thing that I think illustrates.
I'm just trying to
this.
ask whether this is still the case in the 4% fund credit.
We don't, with just the 4% tax credits, we don't raise the bar that high.
Right.
We only raise it a little bit.
Yeah.
So theoretically, that is a very cheap program comparatively. Now, the IRS rules are nothing to shake a stick at. So I want to say the 4% tax credit property is still going to be more expensive than someone who's just going to a bank and getting debt and doing market rate housing, because the IRS requires you to sell these tax credits and there's a return to that investor and there's lawyers and there's reserves for the investor and all that. And so it, even that drives up the cost of housing, just using tax credits in general. So you could say, we shouldn't use tax credits in Vermont. That's fine, but we would be not using the biggest source of funding that we have in this nation to build affordable rental housing. So we need both. We need market rate, private for-profit folks doing the housing they're doing. We need the tax credit housing to make sure that we're not leaving people who are earning $17,000 a year behind. You know, we need all of this to happen. But if I could give one example, like of all these public policy priorities that I have here, I think there are some people who would say, have we gone too far with our energy code and policies? Have we gone too far with the way we're designated downtowns and we've talked enough about mapping and things like that? Have we gone too far with brownfield remediation, all this? But there's a policy that I don't hear anyone argue about, and that's that smart growth building in these historic settlement patterns and downtown areas. I don't hear people saying that we should abandon that. That's why I got sight even on the 4% tax credits. Like, we do not want to use these federal resources to create sprawl. We do want this to be connected to infrastructure. We do want this to be somewhat smart growth. Just that one policy priority of a downtown drives up costs in 6 different ways I'm going to list for you. One, if you're building in a downtown, that's going to be a unique site. That's going to have some weird angles, some topography, some, oh, I got to fit next to the next building. Like a greenfield development is easier because you can just swing that crane around. We don't have a lot of crane development, but like swing your equipment around and not touch another building. You're downtown, you got to pivot. I don't know how to do
Says
that.
the word greenfield development. I mean, I spent 3 decades in California. What you think of as just converting the farm where the farmer doesn't want to farm anymore, flat land, that's a greenfield.
Yeah.
And you're just going in there and saying, I'm gonna plug down, 500 houses on 100 acres.
Severance Corner.
You're getting exactly to my point. So it's room to store the materials.
Oh, sure.
So like
Keep it safe.
Main Street, Burlington, COTS just put an addition on the back of their family shelter of tax credit apartments. And that builder had to truck in and out that equipment, the excavators, the loaders, the whatever, every day. That's paying people to drive for an hour that what would have been construction time. They got to store it somewhere. They got to, where do the roof trusses sit for overnight? You can't build a building overnight. You can't put a backloader on Main Street across from Edmonds Middle School overnight, or for this 8 months it took to build the building. So that takes it. The unique site also means you got to hire an architect every time. Like if this was all greenfield development, I could take my rectangular 14 units and I could use that design 16 times in 16 different towns. I can't do that downtown. First floor commercial space in a downtown. We often want to be able to walk by a shop of some sort or an office building or something and access first floor commercial. Another thing,
So you're saying we don't want to block that access, the
that's a benefit to the downtown. That's why we're building in a downtown.
Right,
We
the
want
merchants,
vitality
we
and,
want
and
the
walking and all this. But that commercial space does not cover its costs. You are losing more in tax credits by having a first floor commercial space than you are gaining in commercial rent. And I don't care how fancy your business is, you just moved in there. If the math doesn't, the tax credit's more valuable. Also, not surprising to a lot of us, any of us here, our downtowns all happen to be next to waterways of various sources. So we have flood remediation, we have, things we have to do that drives up costs. We talked about the shipping and the materials. Downtown, all dirt is dirty in Vermont, essentially, with the way our standards are, but downtown dirt is especially dirty. And it has housed businesses that left behind chemicals and other things. And downtown is where we choose to do a lot of historic preservation, as opposed to that greenfield bulldozer cornfield type development, where you don't have a structure there, you have to protect. So that's one public policy goal of downtown, and I'm explaining to you 6 different ways that it drives up costs. And so when I'm asked why we're driving up the cost of housing, it is to achieve public policy goals well beyond just the housing. And I think, oh no, it's not. You saw my iceberg slide before where I'm like, we say we're doing housing, we're doing so much more. And I sometimes want to turn to the critics and say, like, I'm the superintendent of the schools and you're telling me to cut my budget. And I'm like, do you want me to cut the football team first or the music program? Like, these are the things that you all love, we love. This is what makes Vermont special. And if it's public free money, to your point, don't we want other things besides just shelter? We also want these other things. So comparing a market rate development to a tax credit project are apples and oranges. Yes, they both are above the waterline with housing, but the iceberg's all about what's below the waterline, and those things aren't the same. And that's, I think, what you were pointing out is like, how do you isolate that? If you just take shelter costs, I don't even build housing, and I could build housing for cheaper than tax credit housing is, because the feds gave us an inefficient system and make us work within these IRS rules. But that is what we've been given. And we have added on to it with these public policy
Do
goals.
you have any way of evaluating what, I'm gonna use greenfield loosely because, somebody who's building 3 units, in a small town nearby the town in a field, do you have any way of evaluating what the hard costs of such a project would be?
Market rate, I don't have access to their hard cost data, but we do look at hard cost data across the board, so we can compare hard costs across what we do see. And now that we have the rental revolving loan fund, we are seeing different types of developments that are smaller and more akin to market rate and have more market rate units. And so I do not see and that's what the 2019 cost study report was that Vermont's affordable housing costs were not out of line with all the data that we did have access to.
I'm sorry. Do you mean that your estimates, which are not as accurate because they're more indirect in their calculation, your estimates of the hard costs of simple market rate construction are still in this?
Yep.
They're still in the range
Yes,
of
that's what
the
we found.
tax credit, the 4% tax credit deal?
That is what we found. Yes.
Do you have any sense have you ever tried to quantify the cost of the added
Yes.
Functions of the tax credit versus just market rate?
No, the study looked at all these public policy goals and we tried to quantify those. So we know that for historic preservation, there's historic preservation tax credits. And we know that projects were spending, these were 2019 dollars, and this is based on my memory, but it was something like we were spending $32,000 on historic buildings. Like that was the premium for doing historic. But we're getting like 36,000 per unit in the tax credits. So that one I remember being like, we're about breaking even. Energy is one where we're not breaking even. We are investing $60,000 per unit into all these all electric buildings and meeting our energy goals. And the rebates that we get for heat pumps and all that are $5,000 a unit. They change all the time. So that may not be today's rebate, but my point is that there is a tremendous amount of housing dollars going to meet the energy goals that we have. There's housing dollars going to meet AHS's budget that cannot keep up with the needs. We now have housing staff people who are social workers and doing frontline services to tenants because the designated agencies do not have the staff to meet the tenants' needs for their mental health and other challenges. And so we are using housing dollars to do healthcare. We're using housing dollars to meet our energy goals. We're using housing dollars to clean up our brownfields. We're using housing dollars to put in infrastructure. That's a big one. If everyone paid for their own stuff, housing would be way less expensive. But we have all these public policy goals that drive up the cost, and we've been calling it all housing iceberg. And it's more than that.
So you're really VHHS.
Oh my gosh.
Services,
All
housing
the
and human
letters.
services.
Yeah, all the letters. And I want to be clear, it's not just VHFA. This is done in partnership with VHCB and DHCD, all the letters. Like, we are all jointly funding all these projects. So that's why it's so darn impressive when Gus gets up here and shows the pictures of what they've done. It is incredible what we've been able to do. And my last few slides speak to that. This one speaks to who lives in this tax credit housing. You can see here some demographics. Overall, a two-person household in Vermont, median income's about $82,000. Whereas for a renter, it's only $43,000. It's about half as much. Renters have lower incomes often. Tax credit tenants are earning about $17,000 a year. Again, we'd like to, maybe as a fun Friday night activity, try to think about paying your bills on $17,000 a year. But that is what our tax credit tenants are. You can see the racial breakdown here. These units are very important.
Thank you for adding Hispanic and race.
Yes. So these pie charts, I feel, back to what I said before, I feel very strongly my numbers are always very defensible. I want to be clear that I didn't have time to really get the numbers on these pie charts. So I used averages in Maura's brain that are illustrative to prove a visual point, not to have you challenge me on the actual percentages exactly. I want to just talk about the 4% tax credit for a minute. That, as I said with the pie chart, it's going to pay for the tax credit equity is paying for 35% of that development. And I said you had to go other places to get the other money. This is the ugly layered cake. So we have federal resources, they take on debt. Developers put in some of their earnings. They will leave in the project just because they had a shortfall and they need to not earn as much money on it. The state, that's the VHCB money on the left, that light blue, that's an investment. There's other things that go in there. The gray is the gap. When we say that a 4% tax credit development doesn't pencil, so it doesn't get built, it's the gray. It's that it doesn't work. We're still missing 30% of what's needed to build a building using 4% tax credits. The left shows you that pre-pandemic, we did not use 4% tax credits a lot for new construction. So what did we use them for? We used them for preservation and rehab. We would take existing buildings where we didn't have to buy the land, we didn't have to buy the building. There's some debt, there's some other things we did have to pay for, but we paid for the renovation. And by paying for the renovation, it was cheaper, and that 35% wasn't on such a big number, and you were able to make it work. So we've always used 4% tax credits, but not a lot, and not for new construction before the pandemic.
You're making a cupcake as opposed to.
Thank you. I like it.
I thought the cake looked pretty good.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I was like, agree to disagree. On the gross quote unquote cake.
Sorry.
So then post-pandemic, when there was more money, and I want to draw your eye to that light blue slice of state-controlled resources, that's the difference of what's been happening lately. When we have more housing, it's because of that light blue. We filled in the gray gap. How did you fill it in? You filled it in with one-time money for VHCB and ARPA money that largely went through VHCB. And so
The 14
The
million.
math, 14, much more than that.
What did you say?
Oh, that was the congressional directed spending. No, ARPA money, there was a lot more than that. VHCB got like $100 million 1 year of extra money. And they got a lot of like $80 million of ARPA money at one point.
We have a housing bond too, didn't we?
Exactly. And so that is how we were finally able to have 4% tax credits work for new construction. And my last slide here shows you. At the top, I want to remind you, how do you get 4% tax credits? You finance half the building with private activity bonds. And so you can see here that VHFA 2015 to 2019, we issued $82 million for multifamily in these private activity bonds. But since 2020, we've done $270 million. That's a 230% increase. So my point is, and this is just multifamily, because we use the same stuff for single family, but we're not talking about that today. So if we were able to go from $82 million up to $270 million, that means a lot more multifamily properties were able to draw down the 4% tax credit. And so the table at the bottom in that middle bullet point says that we had a 510% increase in drawing down these 4% tax credits. That's an extra $120 million that Vermont would not have used and would have expired and disappeared into the ether. But you all were smart enough to give that money to VHCB and dedicate the ARPA money to housing and do what had to be done. So you can see that we went from doing 19 projects to 34 projects. We doubled the number, more than doubled the number of units. Look at the new units. That's what I really want to point to. We only did 22 units of new construction using 4% tax credits. We've done a ton of it with the 9% tax credits, another thing, but using 4% tax credits, we
4 years.
we added 5 years.
Well, or 15
Yep.
to 19. Yeah.
Yep, so it's inclusive, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 22 units versus the 5 years since the pandemic, we did 674 units. That means that those 22 units brought in, $31 million of private equity versus $157 million. I just want to say, if we can't keep up the level of state investment that we've been doing, I just want to make sure you all know we're going back to the 2015, 2019 figures. But what are my first 2 slides? With far higher costs, so we won't be able to do that many units.
Yeah.
We won't be lucky enough to get 22 because $10 million doesn't get you what it gets you now because costs are higher.
And it seems to me that a lot of the investors also made out like gangbusters. Being able to,
Investors in tax
Buy-
credits.
so yeah, the people buying the tax credits.
That actually is more complicated than you think because a bank will decide where it wants to park its money. And it can put it in, it can buy tax credits or it could invest it in other vehicles. So what they are calculating is 1, what's the corporate tax rate? Corporate tax rate is lower. So a tax credit is not as valuable right now as it was pre-2017. And interest rates, they used to not be able to earn a lot in interest because interest rates, remember, were like 2% or 0 or whatever they were. And so they weren't earning much. Now they can earn more on stock markets or other investments, just savings accounts. The banks don't invest in savings accounts, but you get my point. They can earn more in interest. So honestly, we have a double whammy where corporate tax rates are lower. So buying tax credits are less valuable. And I can earn more money safely because tax credits come with some risk. If the housing development doesn't abide by all these IRS rules that I keep referencing but not telling you about because they're mind numbing, if someone doesn't follow the rules, those tax credits can be recaptured. And now but that investment was already made. I wrote my check for $10 million as an investor, and now I can't claim $10 million in tax credits. That is a real risk. Has never happened in Vermont. it has happened in the world.
Yeah.
And so-
Pretty good. People who you've heard testify, like Evernorth, for example, they're pretty good at making sure that the rules are followed.
Yeah.
So it's a relatively, compared to being an equity investor.
Yes.
It's a low,
Pretty safe
it's
bet.
pretty bad, but the return is low.
Yes.
In other words, they get, let's say, $1 million of tax credits in return for dumping 900 and some thousand into the development, and that difference is what they earn. And I don't know what the percent of return is.
I would ask Evernorth. It is somewhat complicated.
It's not, the banks do it in part. Very often it's banks because of their Community Redevelopment Act.
Reinvestment.
Reinvestment Act obligations. They have a legal obligation. They get benefits from being good guys, and they don't make a ton of money off it.
Okay. But the other private investors that are not banks, like you said, even like Nike has.
I didn't say that, but
said that.
equity investors can earn, yes, on this.
So are you
Not on
saying
tax
that
credit.
this is, that this 120 additional money that came through is not going to be coming through as expected? And so we are looking more at a hard break on development, at least on the 4%?
I'm saying that what enabled this to happen was the fact that not only were you doing full funding for VHCB, but like I said, there was a year they got an extra $100 million, an extra $80 million. I have not yet heard those numbers bandied about going in a future state. I'm hearing something, but not that. The BAA, I believe your letter was for an extra $30 million for them. And I just want to say, that is wonderful. Please do that. I am in full support. Don't get me wrong. But that is a dramatic decrease from what we've seen. So we will not be using 4% tax credits for new construction the way we have in the last couple of years.
We would have to substitute, one way or another, we would have to substitute state resources or a state bond issue or something for that. Maura, I have one other question for you, or I see you've completed your.
Yes, those are my slides. I will just say it goes back to, just to answer the visual here, we're going back to this world where we have this gap and you all can choose to make this slice of blue bigger.
It's the ARPA money.
Yeah.
It's the ARPA money.
Yep.
That's what it comes down to.
Yep. And there were also general funds as well as ARPA, but you're right. Sometimes the ARPA kind of enabled the general funds because there was just so much money,
Right.
but we are going back and forth between these two pies.
We heard testimony that, just a reference, one quick reference to a new policy, which I think the particular witness said was a VHFA policy, that said that you couldn't do, a small developer couldn't do a tax credit deal unless they'd already done one. Is there such a policy?
There is not a new policy. There has always been in our qualified allocation plan that we look at the experience and capacity of developers. Again, the IRS rules are complex. And so, as in most states, we like to see that someone has some experience owning and managing bigger developments where we have faith that they can not only deal with all that syndication and tax credits and all that, but also own and operate the housing according to certain standards. So we've always said that we'll let new people get their first tax credit award, but they probably are going to have a pretty good sized portfolio. They'll have established property management, well, they'll have had a track record. So what are we doing to bring more new entrants into the development pipeline? We started the rental revolving loan fund, which thank you for your letter, but hope it's now in the governor's budget for $15 million. That's a program that is state funding, doesn't come with IRS rules. So the application's easy. We took a lot of the government rules out. It doesn't have to be perpetually affordable. We're trying to make it more accessible so newer and emerging developers can buy down some affordability using that money. And yes, there's government money, and yes, we watch it and make sure it's all well spent, but it doesn't come with the really complex IRS rules. And then if they do some rental RLF projects for a bit, maybe then they have that capacity to get a tax credit deal. Same thing with a similar program. We are creating these programs and giving people technical assistance. We hired a company that's giving TA to developers so that they can be tax credit ready. So, yes, we do have a high bar because we are protecting the program. And frankly, I gotta say, we're protecting the developer because they would not want that investor. We don't want our first example of an investor having credits reclaimed because the project was not well run. But I can tell you, Zach Hale Development Group doing the Ben High project, that's a 4% new units, not new construction, 'cause it's a historic building, but new units there. He's never gotten tax credits before. M&S Development in Brattleboro had never gotten tax credits before. They did a new building in Brattleboro called the DeWitt Block. And there are other examples where we are giving their first tax credit award, but M&S Development has been around and doing housing for a long time. Hale Development Group had a portfolio and been doing it. So it's not that we won't do it. It's that we do have to underwrite the capacity of the developer.
I can attest from my own personal experience that here I am, a lawyer, and I teach land transactions, finance and development, and I never would have made it through the tax credit deal I did in the absence of amazing guidance from that we hired. It's just
Complicated.
it's complicated. Thank
So
you.
there's probably people listening on YouTube right now who are like, she's not really explaining that program. And I'm like, I would, but like my team, people get master's degrees in just this one program. So it would take a couple years.
Any final questions before we end? I think we are going to.
I'm sorry, can I just make my last point? Because I'm remembering now that it came up. So you all had a question about the qualified allocation plan and how it works. I hope I've answered those questions about, that is our public document where we tell the world and developers where the bar is, what they have to do to perform. And that is something that VHFA controls. We are in the process of updating that right now. And we are actively changing what we're proposing in that so that you can still do all of that great work and hit all those public policy goals. And we are really increasing our look at costs. We have always looked at costs. We always report on those hard costs and construction costs and comparing projects and judged applicants based on that. But we're going farther now with saying, you may not have to reach all these public policy goals if you can bring us some really low cost housing. So we're trying to create more ways of being competitive besides just things that could have the impact of driving up costs. So that's something that we update that document every other year and we're active with that now. Thank you.
Well, I think if everybody's ready, I'd like to adjourn. Are we ready to adjourn?